All right, think about the map of the world today. We look at all those lines dividing nations, and it's super easy to think of them as permanent, right? Like natural fixtures of geography. But the reality? The vast majority of those borders are actually the direct result of centuries of relentless expansion, maritime races, and overlapping imperial claims. In this explainer, we're diving deep into the data, the geography, and the timelines that literally built the modern world.
Okay, let's dive right into this. 50%. Obviously not a small margin, and it represents a genuinely staggering reality about the world we navigate right now.
Over half, more than 50% of the world's current national borders were drawn strictly as a result of just two empires, the British and the French. When we study this era, we really aren't just looking at dusty history books. We are looking at the literal, physical shape of modern geopolitics. Think about regions like the Middle East, or across the entire African continent. Many of those perfectly straight-line borders, they were negotiated in European drawing rooms, often grouping vastly diverse populations together or splitting them apart completely. This statistic alone proves just how deeply this era of imperialism is etched into the very map of our planet today.
So here's the path we're taking today. We'll start by defining colonial empires, then trace the first global networks, examine the height of European empires, detail the French global footprint, and finally, look at empires across the globe.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, defining colonial empires. What exactly transforms a nation into an empire?
Well, a colonial empire isn't just about sheer size. It's a state actively engaging in colonization, meaning it's expanding its territory either contiguously, right next door, or by claiming overseas possessions. And it's really the specific concept of overseas territories being governed by a distinct, often distant nation-state that truly defines the modern empires we're unpacking here.
While ancient groups like the Phoenicians or the Greeks settled tons of islands and coasts across the Mediterranean, those ancient colonies were actually politically independent from the city-states they originated from. Modern empires, which emerged much later, were an entirely different beast. They maintained strict political and economic control over their distant territories. This totally shifted the paradigm of global power from just localized influence to centralized global extraction.
Moving right along to Section 2, the first global networks. Let's look at when this all really kicked off.
Back in the 15th century, the most advanced European maritime powers, Spain and Portugal, began this totally unprecedented race of exploration. And they weren't just sailing for the thrill of it, right? The rising Ottoman Empire was heavily taxing the traditional overland routes to the east. This effectively forced Spanish and Portuguese explorers to seek out completely new oceanic routes just to access those highly lucrative spice and silk markets in India and China. That initial impulse, basically trying to bypass middlemen to secure trade monopolies, sparked the very first truly global networks in the 16th century. And that eventually laid the geopolitical groundwork for the massive era of new imperialism we see in the 19th century.
Which brings us to Section 3, the height of European empires. This is when things reach an absolutely massive scale.
By steadily expanding its technological and maritime supremacy, the British Empire grew into the largest in human history. They ruled over a full quarter, literally 25% of the Earth's entire land area. But it doesn't stop there. This immense footprint meant they also controlled roughly 24% of the global population at the time. It was an empire where, as the famous saying goes, the sun truly never set on its administrative borders.
This unprecedented level of global dominance allowed Britain to act as the definitive global hegemon. Their supremacy essentially ushered in a century often referred to as Pax Britannica, or the British Peace. Running from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 all the way to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, this era was defined by the Royal Navy, effectively acting as a global police force. By maintaining an overwhelming naval advantage, Britain secured global maritime trade routes, enforced its own economic interests, and created this unparalleled grip on international politics. And that grip actually suppressed major conflicts between rival powers for almost 100 years.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. The French global footprint.
80. France held about 80 colonies throughout its history. That is the second most of any nation in the world, trailing only behind the British Empire.
The French footprint literally spanned the entire globe. In the Americas, it stretched from the lucrative fur trading networks of New France up in North America down to the immense sugar wealth of Caribbean islands like Saint-Domingue, and all the way down to French Guiana in South America. In Africa, their reach was massive, encompassing the vast expanse of French West Africa, the critical territory of Algeria, and the island of Madagascar. And extending all the way into Asia and Oceania, they held French into China and French Polynesia. From the Caribbean to Antarctica, the economic drivers and the sheer territorial scope were, frankly, breathtaking. Now, it's important to note this expansion happened in two very distinct phases. The first, French colonial empire spanning the 16th and 17th centuries, was primarily focused on those lucrative holdings in the Americas and Asia. However, a series of devastating conflicts with Britain, most notably the Seven Years' War and later the Napoleonic Wars, essentially stripped France of its major ambitions in those specific regions. So, starting in 1830, with the invasion of Algiers, they pivoted. They built a second empire that was heavily focused on rapid expansion into Africa and Southeast Asia.
So why does this historical scale matter to us today? Well, around 40 modern countries eventually gained their independence from France. Understanding this immense global footprint is absolutely crucial to understanding the sovereignty, the borders, and the administrative DNA of dozens of modern nations today.
Finally, let's pull back and look at the broader picture in Section 5, Empires Across the Globe.
Because colonialism definitely wasn't exclusively a Western European phenomenon. Asian powers and New World nations also established their own extensive spheres of influence in overseas territories. The Empire of Japan, for instance, held Taiwan, Korea, and the South Seas Mandate. The Ottoman Empire controlled vast stretches across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the United States, operating from the Americas, acquired territories like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Take the Ottoman Empire, for example. Operating from the 14th century all the way into the 20th century, their multi-continental reach was just staggering. They expanded deep into Europe, holding places like Greece and Bulgaria, across Asia, controlling Syria and Iraq, and throughout North Africa, ruling over Egypt and Algeria. What made the Ottoman Empire incredibly unique during this era of global empires is that it served as a massive, contiguous land bridge directly connecting East and West. That stands in stark contrast to the purely maritime, overseas empires built by Western European powers.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States began establishing its own formal and informal external possessions beginning in the late 19th century. Following the Spanish-American War in 1899, the U.S. took control of the Philippines, which it held until 1946, as well as Puerto Rico and Guam, which actually maintain their territorial status today. They also administered the highly strategic Panama Canal Zone for nearly a century, securing a vital, real game-changer of a maritime shortcut between two oceans.
So when you step back and layer the British, the French, the Ottomans, the Japanese, the Americans, and earlier powers like the Spanish and Portuguese all on top of one another, you get a world shaped by relentless, often chaotic expansion. It's a dense puzzle of overlapping claims, rapidly shifting protectorates, and post-war mandates. The subsequent wave of global decolonization and independence movements ultimately sculpted the incredibly complex and sometimes fragile geopolitical map we navigate today.
It really makes you wonder. With over 50% of our current global borders originally drawn by historic empires, we have to ask ourselves, how much of our future will continue to be defined by the lines drawn in our colonial past?